Belfast is a city of gangs. In East Belfast, the 500-strong Woodstock Tartan centres around a youth club in the midst of their area where, like any other teenagers in any other city, they come to play their music and meet their girls. They're almost all between 16 and 21 years old. Blue denims are their uniform, and they call themselves Tartans to mark the link with Scotland that runs so strong throughout the Ulster Protestant community. Here in the club, they're kept peacefully busy. But it's once they get out on the streets that the chance of trouble follows them. The authorities regard them as yet another major hazard to Belfast's prospects for peace. But the Tartans claim to see themselves as the guardians of the Protestant areas against Catholic attack.
An ordinary street gang in England is just there to create disturbances and vandalise, wreck property. We're there to defend our area against attacks by our IRA gangs.
George and Harry are two young Tartans, like so many other people in the Belfast ghettos, unwilling to be identified. But they like to claim that their gangs have now become the defenders of their area against Catholic attack.
In the course of IRA gangs attacking our area, we have to put up barricades. And it's just unfortunate that somebody's car has to be used, or it has to be used. We have to keep them out any way we can, and by any means we can. But there'll come a day when we'll not defend, because we're getting shot down now defending. And there was a Negro was shot there about 3 months ago, and he just said 2 weeks before he died, if I can't live like a man, I want to die like one. And that's the way we feel. They're not letting us live like men, so therefore we'd be better off attacking them and dying like men.
The trouble is here that the enemy are always so close. If you're feeling furious about some political move, some new concession to the other side, there are so many tempting targets for reprisal just across the street. Down here in East Belfast, in a sea of loyalists, there's the isolated Catholic pocket of Short Strand. The Protestant areas here have had more than their fair shares of bombing and shooting. Every morning, they wake up and look across the street at the very community they may be blaming for the latest round of trouble. In the light of this, it's less surprising that they don't seem too bothered about anything the Tartans may get up to. Well, where's the borderline lie, George?
This is the borderline here. The road is the borderline of this area. And on the other side of that road is all Roman Catholics. Where you're standing on is all Protestant.
And what are you trying to do yourselves?
Well, when IRA mobs come out and attack this Protestant area, we have to beat them back, because the soldiers don't be able to seem to do this.
You lived in this area all your life, George?
Yeah.
If you had a complete choice, would you go on living in this area all your life, George?
At the minute I would, because they need us here to protect them against the Roman Catholics.
Harry, would you?
Well, I'm here to defend our part of town, you know, that's what we've been doing, you know. So I'll stay here until Ulster's Protestant sort of thing, you know.
The trouble is that in the ghettos, the Tartans are given every encouragement to believe everything they say about the respectability of their own activities. All the people who in any other society might be trying to talk them out of trouble, in East Belfast seem to be backing them all the way.
What do you think about the Tartans yourself?
I think they're a great bunch of boys.
Why are the police suddenly so unpopular here? Because in the old days, it used to be everybody wanting the police in and the army out.
Police aren't unpopular here, just happened last... They turned on the Tartans after the Vanguard rally last Wednesday night for no reason at all. The boys weren't doing anything.
What is it that makes the Tartans... I mean, there have always been street gangs in Belfast. What is it that makes the Tartans any different from any of the others? Better or
These
worse?
are our
If the Tartans
boys.
weren't in this area wouldn't be standing at all.
These are our boys off tomorrow. That's what it
The
is.
police turned on the Tartan. It wasn't them that started the rioting here at all.
We depend on the Tartans
For what?
for defend us.
After all, they're standing at night, round the corners, the police comes along, they'll say, move on, but where are they going to?
The Tartans are only the start of it.
What happens next?
It'll come to the whole Protestant population and have to come out and do what they're doing to get anything in the country.
The police and the troops who have to handle the Tartans now find their usual roles in Protestant areas reversed. The police, who in the past have been far more popular than the army, are accused of ruthless tactics in the manner in which they've driven the gangs back from the border of Catholic areas. They and the soldiers have to bear the brunt of the frustrations of the whole Protestant community, young and old, who bitterly resent the current kid-glove approach in handling the Catholics and the flow of concessions to the Protestants' hated enemy.
There's a constant effort to use the RUC on the streets whenever possible to bring back some semblance of normal policing. The Tartans' complaint is that the police only really crack down on the Protestant side of the fence. But the answer to that, of course, is that no one will risk using the police with their batons against a Catholic crowd when there's so often a gunman in the background. In the end, even routine hooliganism has to be handled as a military problem with troops on hand, as long as even the smallest child with a rock can claim he's a soldier for his sect.
Come the night, and the Tartans are out. In ones and twos, in groups that can build into hundreds in a flash if there's trouble, they walk the streets, relishing their newfound local respectability as the accepted keepers of the faith. All young gangs in all cities have always fancied that they were heroes. But here, there are even adults who are prepared to call them that too.
I think it'll end up in civil war, which is a thing that we don't want to happen, is a civil war. Because innocent people get killed in civil wars.
But why do you think it's going to be civil war?
Because they're pushing the Protestant people back, so they can be pushed back no further.
One of the worst problems on both sides of the fence in Ulster is that in the Belfast ghettos you can get away with almost anything by using the blanket excuse that it's for the cause. The Tartans aren't really a bit more notable than the sort of street gangs you find in the slums of any English city. It's just that here they've found an enemy their parents aren't too unhappy to see them fighting. The sort of social problems that cause juvenile delinquency anywhere else in the world combine with a political frustration they can use to dignify their feuds and their boredom. And it's this false status that makes them the threat they are.
George Wallace first came into national prominence in the early 60s, the era of civil rights. He personally defied the enrollment of Negroes at the University of Alabama and proclaimed a policy of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever.
If you had a third of your population in England, Negro, like we have in Alabama, you'd have different customs than the way you do have. In your colonies in other parts of the world, you had total segregation. You had it in India. You had it in your African colonies. Why do you say that you wouldn't have it in England? You Englishmen segregated in Africa, didn't you?
But it was a quite different
kind of... Oh, it was quite different, yes. It's always different when it affects you. But it's the same everywhere. It's just you're trying to make it different, but it's not any different.
When his term of office was over, he made sure that the Wallace tradition still lived on in Alabama by getting his first wife, Lurleen, elected as his successor. Wallace himself continued to push the same anti-desegregation line, but now in a much more sophisticated way. In 1967, he came north to campaign in the Midwest, trying to give himself a national base before the presidential race next year.
I have the reputation of being a believer in segregation in the public school systems of Alabama. I do not recommend any sort of school system for any other state in the Union. I recommend only that they run their schools as they see fit. And if I were the President of the United States, I would not advocate segregation or integration in any state in the Union. I would recommend only that the people of Birmingham, Alabama, run their school systems as they thought best through their elected officials. Here, the British people.
On international affairs, his views were an extension of his domestic ideas.
I would not think about joining any movement to bring down a fine government such as exists in Rhodesia. I think the most ludicrous and asinine thing I can think of is the sanctions imposed upon Rhodesia.
And the other main plank in his platform was one related to forced desegregation, the rights of the individual states to determine their own affairs without interference from the federal government. It was a theme with a lot of appeal. Not only was it a respectable mask for resistance to granting civil rights, it also had all the overtones of the little man standing up for himself against a distant and unsympathetic big government.
And I tell you what is going to be the masses of little people in our country. When I say little people, I mean the mass who work with their hands every day in the steel mills, in the textile mills, and on the farms, and the little businessmen. They're going to join together, and they're going to shake some politicians up in this country. So you ask me, what am I thinking about? And I'll tell you what I'm thinking about. That we are going to have a choice. We're going to have a choice about local government. We're going to have a choice about foreign aid. We're going to have a choice about domestic institutions. We're going to have a choice about our farms in 1968. And if they don't give us a choice, then we in Alabama are going to see that you and the people all over this country have that choice in 1968. Why don't you young punks just get on out of the auditorium? Why don't you young punks get out of the auditorium?
In 1968, George Wallace set the campaign alight by his decision to enter the presidential race as a third-party candidate for his own American Independent Party. He quickly became the focus of liberal hatreds, a pet phobia. Yet in the event, Wallace did quite well. He got 10 million votes, 13.5% of the total. Not enough to give him the balance of power in the Electoral College as he'd hoped, but still a performance which helped to throw the election to Nixon by taking crucial votes away from Humphrey, the Democratic candidate. It was now obvious that Wallace's appeal was not confined to the South. Before the 1968 campaign, Lurleen, George's first wife, had died tragically of cancer. 2 years later, he remarried, giving the name of Mrs. Wallace to Cornelia, a wife who brought a new polish, as well as new trendy suits and shirts, to her husband's image. George was now ready to run a much more sophisticated campaign, to capitalize on the latent conservatism of working-class Democrats all over the country. This year, George Wallace declared himself a runner in the presidential race, not as an independent, but now as a contender for the Democratic nomination. He set out to fight a seemingly formidable list of Democratic challengers for the convention's nomination.
I want the people of Florida to take the opportunity to tell the National Democratic Party that unless you straighten up and fly right, you're going to find continuous and continued defeat at the polls.
When the Florida primary came round in March, there was already an issue ready-made for Wallace to exploit: school busing of black children into white districts by federal order in the name of desegregation. It was the perfect political seam to mine.
You boys, I tell you what, this busing business, it sure is amusing to see them all reversing themselves 180 degrees and running into one another. All of them, you know, in the Senate. I have the record right here. You know, some of the candidates have come down here in Florida and said, I'm against busing. I wish they'd have voted against busing when they voted on it the first time up yonder in Washington. If they had, you wouldn't have any busing.
George Wallace is telling us to forget Martin Luther King. He's telling us to forget 17 years' worth of progress in the movement towards equality for all Americans. He's telling us to forget about the civil rights bills that we fought for in the Congress, and, you know, we're just beginning to feel them beginning to work.
Wallace won in Florida, and he went on to do well in Indiana. While Lindsay was pushed out of the race and Muskie fizzled out, while Richard Nixon was reversing his busing policy, Wallace went on collecting convention support, exploiting every discontent and grievance of Little America, particularly, and perhaps prophetically, the law and order issue. The impact of this Wallace message, even though it might come by proxy from now on, will be felt for the rest of the presidential race. Come November, Wallace could well be strong enough, both physically and politically, to fight as a third-party candidate. At the very least, the Wallace message on law and order will be heard again and again this summer.